Welcome. I'm the Reverend Tony Lorenzen, and everyone here at the Mattatuck Unitarian Universalist Society and the Unitarian Universalist Church in Meriden wish you a warm and courageous National Coming Out Day. This morning, we have an excellent guest speaker, Kevin Jennings, the CEO of Lambda Legal, who will present a talk he calls Queeroes, the people who made LGBTQ history. I invite you to enter in to this online worship with your heart and mind open and be ready to celebrate with us. Being Unitarian Universalists, we begin all our services by lighting the symbol of our faith, the flaming chalice. Please join me with the chalice lighting words that are on the screen. May this flame remind us to practice radical hospitality, extending welcome to all who want to be with us online and in person to worship and create beloved community. We're glad you're here. Let's enter into this service together.
Take a moment to think about who you are. Now imagine pretending to be someone else, someone who may better fit in with what others expect. Your friends, your employer, your parents. Imagine keeping a secret that you keep only to yourself. Many years ago, quite a few people lived in exactly that way, hiding a part of who they really were: lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, other. As time went by, a few began to step out into the reality of their own lives. They loved whomever they chose. They created their own style. They found open-minded allies. They became politically active. Cultural standards were not followed. LGBTQ folks were teased for being different. They were abused by some who feared the unfamiliar. They were even barred from employment in some situations. During and after the civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s, people who identified as LGBTQ began to assert their rights to live the way they wanted publicly without harassment. Unitarian Universalists were their strong allies. UU's thought about how to support the diversity we promote and embrace. We had to put our faith into action. We believe in justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. We believe in the inherent worth and dignity of every person. How do we show that we welcome all people? A group of Moose congregants got together about 20 years ago in a process to officially become a welcoming congregation. We worked with the UUA, who taught us how to become sensitive to the needs of others, not to open our doors to all others, but to welcome all enthusiastically and sensitively. When we became a welcoming congregation, not everyone understood what that meant. I even knew someone who asked, "Aren't you afraid of becoming a gay church?" Like there would be something wrong with that. Every year we must offer conversations around LGBTQ issues. A sermon that specifically addresses the topic, as Kevin Jennings will do today. We make personal values public, and we donate to support a community organization like True Colors or Pride in the Hills. What you can do is to make yourself known as an ally. Help someone who may feel insecure about questioning. Stand up for someone who's being treated unkindly. Respect those who are different. Rid the community of fear of the unfamiliar. Remember that is love that makes a family, love that makes a community. Show your best side.
Kevin Jennings is the CEO of Lambda Legal. Kevin's personal contributions to the LGBTQ movement began in 1988 when he helped students create the first school-based Gay-Straight Alliance Club, leading him to found and lead the Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Education Network, or GLSEN, for 18 years. He then served as Assistant Secretary of Education for President Obama, after which he led the Arcus Foundation, the world's largest foundation for LGBT rights. And today he is our speaker. Please welcome Kevin Jennings.
Good morning. It's wonderful to be back for my second time at the UU Church in Woodbury. And I want to wish you all a National Coming Out Day. And National Coming Out Day commemorates the 1987 March on Washington for LGBT rights, which I was thrilled to participate in. And it was a really life-changing experience for me. And the reason National Coming Out Day was created was to encourage people to come out and share their identities with their friends and families and neighbors. And I'm very grateful to have been invited on National Coming Out Day to share a bit of LGBTQ history with you. In 1994, I was on the planning committee for the first ever LGBTQ History Month. And I'd like to do a little sermonette for you today in which I introduce you to some LGBTQ history. And a key thing I want you to know, if you forget everything else I say to you today, is that LGBT people are not the newcomers to the North American continent. Prejudice against us is. This is a photograph of a person named Wewa. Wewa was what we would call today a transgender person. But it's very dangerous to use modern labels to describe people in the past, because those aren't the labels they would have used to describe themselves. Among Native Americans, the term that would have been used would have been a two-spirit person. Native Americans esteemed and respected two-spirit people because they had been given a special vision by the spirit world in which they had both male and female spirits. And because they had been given this special vision, they were esteemed and respected as having special powers. Wewa, in fact, was chosen by the Zuni people of what is now New Mexico as their ambassador to Washington in 1888, when the Zunis had to negotiate a new treaty with the white government in Washington to govern relations between the Zunis and the United States government. And I think this is a really fascinating moment in history because it reveals the different attitudes between the white people who so disregarded people that we would today call trans people, prejudice against trans people still so common that the American Medical Association last year declared violence against trans people an epidemic in the United States. Yet among Native people, a trans person could be so esteemed that they would be sent as the ambassador of their people to Washington. This began to change with the arrival of white Europeans in the 15 and 1600s on the North American continent. First, the Spaniards in what is now Florida in the 1500s, and then the Puritans in what is now New England in the 1600s. This next slide shows us the capital crimes of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the 1642. In 1642, there were 15 capital crimes in Massachusetts Bay. 9 of them dealt with sex, showing the Puritans were a little obsessed with the sex. One of them said, if a man lieth with man, he shall surely be put to death. And this really was the first of what became known as the sodomy laws, which criminalized same-sex sexual behavior throughout the colonies and would remain on the books in one form or another until the 21st century in what would become the United States. Sodomy laws meant that if you loved someone of the same sex, you could be put to death throughout the colonies. When the colonies became independent of Great Britain in the 1770s and the United States was formed, they had to rewrite their laws. And Thomas Jefferson, who was in the Virginia House of Burgesses and was considered a great liberal, proposed that they downgrade sodomy from being a capital crime to being one that would be punished only by castration. This was considered so liberal that it was turned down by the House of Burgesses, and sodomy remained a capital crime, one for which you could be put to death in what became the state of Virginia in the 1770s. Despite this, LGBT people persevered and found ways to form communities. On this slide, what you see is a map of places where African American lesbians in Manhattan congregated and gathered, restaurants, bars, community places in the 1930s and 40s. The fact is that LGBT people found ways to form community even in the hostile environments in which they lived in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. And in the early 20th century, they began finding ways to fight back. The first person to organize the LGBT community was this man, Henry Gerber. Henry Gerber was a German immigrant. He was sent as part of the American occupying army to Germany after World War I, where perhaps he learned of the work of Magnus Hirschfeld. Magnus Hirschfeld had founded the first gay rights movement in the world in Germany and had advocated for the repeal of sodomy laws in Germany. When Gerber returned to Chicago, where he lived after serving in the American Army, he began to organize the first known LGBT rights group in American history, the Society for Human Rights. And here you see their incorporation papers with the state of Illinois on December 10th, 1924. The Society for Human Rights you probably have never heard of, and part of why you've never heard of the Society for Human Rights is because of what happened to its members. In 1924, it was illegal to mail anything about homosexuality through the U.S. mails. It was automatically considered pornography, even if it had no erotic content and no illustrations. And the Society for Human Rights decided to publish a magazine called Friendship and Freedom. When the U.S. Postal Service found out that such a magazine was being mailed, they impounded all the copies, and they had all of the people on this register with the state of Illinois arrested. These people were eventually released, but when Gerber tried to return to his job at the, yes, you guessed it, U.S. Post Office, he was immediately fired from his job for violating postal regulations. And the members of the society were so traumatized that they disbanded. But it's important to realize that many people think that the LGBT movement started at the Stonewall riot in 1969, and we will get to that later in the lecture. But in fact, the first organizing for LGBT rights started in America almost a century ago in 1924 in Chicago. In the 1940s and 50s, things got severely worse for LGBT people in America. During the McCarthy era, we're all familiar with the so-called Red Scare, when there were witch hunts for communists. People are less familiar with the so-called Lavender Scare. In 1953, President Eisenhower passed Executive Order 104500, which banned the employment of known perverts by the federal government. And it literally became illegal to be employed by the federal government or any of its contractors if you were known to be gay or lesbian. And thousands of people were purged from the federal government for being known perverts. Despite this, LGBT people continued to fight back. Two of them were these women, Phyllis Martin and Dell Lyon. Phyllis Martin and Dell Lyon founded America's first lesbian rights organization, the Daughters of Bilitis, in San Francisco in 1955. I want you to think about the courage it took to do that in 1955, when you could be fired from your job just for being known as gay or lesbian, when you could be put in a mental hospital and, against your will, and subjected to treatments like lobotomies or castration against your will, when being gay was literally a crime for which you could be put in prison. And if you were a woman, when you couldn't get a credit card or a checking account without the signature of your father or your husband. Yet Phyllis and Dell organized a lesbian rights organization. They'll come back later in our talk. It was common practice in the 1950s and 60s for the police to come into gay bars, to rough up the patrons, and to extort money from them because the patrons knew that if they were exposed as being gay or lesbian, they would lose their jobs and possibly be put in prison or in mental institutions. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, gay and lesbian people began to fight back, including people like the person in this picture, Jose Sarria. Jose Sarria was a drag performer in San Francisco who owned a prominent gay bar. And they got tired of being harassed and seeing their patrons being harassed because they were LGBT. So in 1961, Jose Sarria made history as the first out LGBT person to ever run for political office in American history. You probably have heard of someone named Harvey Milk, the man who actually was elected to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors in 1978, being the first out LGBT person to ever be elected to municipal office in American history. But you maybe never have heard of Jose Sarria, who actually in 1961, 17 years before Harvey Milk, became the first person to actually run. And in the 1960s, across America, all kinds of people started standing up and demanding change, including people like this man, Bayard Rustin. This wasn't new for Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin had been a longtime peace and social justice activist. He had led the first freedom rides across the South in the 1940s, being arrested in my hometown of Winston-Salem, North Carolina in 1944, when he had led an integrated bus ride across the South. He had come to Montgomery, Alabama in the 1950s and had helped teach the principles of nonviolent civil disobedience to his mentee, Martin Luther King. He also, throughout all of his work, was an out and proud gay man. He frequently was purged from the civil rights movement because he refused to hide who he was. But in 1963, when Martin Luther King decided to have a march on Washington, which he announced with only 6 weeks advance notice, he turned to the other leaders of the civil rights movement and said, "You know there is only one man with the skill to organize this march." And he insisted that Bayard Rustin be put in charge of the march. And with only 6 weeks' notice, Bayard Rustin organized the March on Washington, which Martin Luther King closed with the famous "I Have a Dream" speech. We all remember that speech. But how many of us remember the first speech of the day, which Bayard Rustin gave on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial? The example of the African American Civil Rights Movement and of Bayard Rustin inspired other LGBT people to think they can do the same thing. One of them was the second man in this photograph, Frank Kameny. Frank Kameny was denied a job in the federal government thanks to Eisenhower's executive order prohibiting the employment of so-called known perverts because of their sexual orientation. And in 1965, he organized the first picket march of the White House for LGBT rights. And here are he and his compatriots outside the White House, picketing in 1965, when being gay could be you put in a mental hospital or get you arrested. Imagine their courage. Frank's close friend, Barbara Jennings, decided she could do the same thing. And in Philadelphia, every July 4th in the 1960s, she organized what she called the annual reminder. On the day of the year when tourists were thronging Independence Hall, Barbara and her friends got out in front and picketed, reminding the tourists that not all Americans yet had their civil rights, and picketing on behalf of LGBT rights. And by the late 60s, LGBT people had had enough. The police did what they always did. On one night, June 28, 1969, they came into a bar called the Stonewall in New York City, and they began to rough up the patrons. And the patrons decided they had had enough. And they fought back. And they took over the bar, and they drove the police out. And here they are outside the bar, having liberated the bar from the police. That event, the Stonewall riot, would turn the course of LGBT history and is celebrated every June with what we now call Pride parades. LGBT people said, "We have had enough, and we will no longer be ashamed." Among the leaders of that event were these two women, Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, trans women of color who said, "We want to have a different world," and who didn't just say it, they took to the streets and they demanded it. Now, the 70s were an amazing period for the LGBT community in which people came out by the millions, and we began to see the first passage of laws protecting LGBT people instead of laws stigmatizing LGBT people. And we began to see the repeal of some of the sodomy laws, which had been on the books since the 1600s. But then, in 1981, a horrific new virus began to appear. a virus that seemed to, for some reason, kill young gay men with diseases like Kaposi's sarcoma, which previously had only struck, a strange cancer that had only struck elderly men of Mediterranean descent. And doctors began to call it gay cancer. Then they began to notice that these young gay men were having immune system problems, and they called it GRID, Gay-Related Immune Deficiency Syndrome. And then they began to notice that their entire immune systems were collapsing, and not just gay people were getting it, and they called it Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, or AIDS. AIDS, a word that our President Ronald Reagan would not say in public for 6 years, by which time over 50,000 Americans had died, more than who died in the Vietnam War. But, as the LGBT community always does, people did not take it lying down. They organized and they fought back, led by this man, Larry Kramer. Larry Kramer knew what had happened in Germany. In Germany, the gay rights movement organized by Magnus Hirschfeld had come to a horrifying end in the 1930s, when the Nazis came to power, forced gay men into concentration camps where they wore pink triangles and were exterminated by the thousands. This time, Larry Kramer said, we will not be silent, because silence equals death. And he organized a group called ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. And LGBT people took to the streets in the thousands, organizing protests modeled after Martin Luther King, using the same nonviolent civil disobedience techniques, forcing the government to pay attention, seizing control of the New York Stock Exchange, the National Institutes of Health, and in a protest I am proud I was arrested in, blocking the Brooklyn Bridge at rush hour. Eventually, the government was forced to pay attention, and treatments for the disease were discovered and disseminated by the late 1990s, turning it from a death sentence into a chronic manageable illness. With this, the LGBT movement gained a new lease on life, and progress resumed, partly because of the courage of people like John Lawrence and Tyrone Garner, the men in this slide. They were arrested in the late 1990s by the police in Houston, Texas, who entered their home on a no-knock warrant and found them in the act of making love. Texas was still one of the 16 states where it was illegal for same-sex couples to engage in sexual relations. The old sodomy laws first promulgated by the Puritans in the 1640s. Tyrone and John fought back, and they sued, with the assistance of the organization I am today CEO of, Lambda Legal. And in 2003, the Supreme Court agreed, and they threw out the sodomy laws, finally ending a 400-year reign of terror against gay couples. The same year, these two women, Hillary and Julie Goodrich, decided that they wanted their relationship to be given the same respect as if they were two people of different sexes, and they sued the state of Massachusetts. And in November 2003, the state of Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court agreed, and Massachusetts became the first state in the country to accord same-sex couples the right to marry. In 2008, California became a state that also accorded the same rights. And the mayor of San Francisco, Gavin Newsom, sent a message to all the other municipal leaders of California. He said, on the first day in which we can do same-sex marriages, you're all going to wait, because I have a special couple who get to go first. And you'll remember who they were. Del Martin. And our friends from the 50s. Del and Phyllis. They were still alive. They had been fighting for 50 years for the right to marry. And here is Gavin Newsom, then mayor of San Francisco, today the governor of California, conducting their marriage, making them the first couple in the state of California to get married. In 2015, Lambda Legal, the organization I today run, would win the Obergefell versus Hodges decision at the Supreme Court, making marriage equality the law of the land, so that not just Phyllis and Dell, but any two people of the same sex who were in love could marry. Remember Frank Kameny, the man who picketed the White House in 1965? Well, here he is inside the White House in 2011, accepting a pin from President Obama, right after President Obama signed a new law granting same-sex couples the same benefits as couples of the opposite sex who worked for the federal government. The same government that in 1953 said that LGBT people could not work for the government. Frank would die a few months later, ironically, on this day, National Coming Out Day. Now, I don't want to leave you feeling like everything's all better. If you look at this map, you'll see that in 70 countries around the globe, it is still illegal to be LGBT. You can be put in jail in 70 countries for engaging in same-sex sexual acts. In several of those countries, you can still be put to death. And the fight goes on. The woman on the left in this picture is Sharon McGowan, the legal director of Lambda Legal. The woman on the right is Amy Stevens. Amy Stevens worked at a funeral home in Michigan. And in 2014, she decided to tell her employer that she was trans. Her employer fired her. That was perfectly legal in the state of Michigan. But like LGBT people often do, Amy decided to fight back, and she sued. And in October of 2019, she had her day in court, the Supreme Court. And she was the first plaintiff who was trans to ever have her case argued in the highest court in our land. And on June 15th, 2020, justice was served when the Supreme Court, in a 6-3 ruling, found in Amy's favor and made discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity illegal, so that LGBT people no longer had to fear that they could be fired from their jobs simply because of their sexual orientation or their gender identity. Amy Stevens won the right for LGBT people to be judged solely on their job performance, so that they no longer had to fear they would be fired because of who they were. Amy didn't live to see that day. Amy died in May of 2020. There's a saying in the line of work that I do: justice deferred is justice denied. Justice was deferred for years for Amy, and she was denied the chance to see justice done. But because of her courage, because of her sacrifice, because of her leadership, LGBT people today are freer than they were before. And that leaves us all with a challenge and a responsibility. What are we doing to make sure that the next generation is freer than we are? We enjoy freedoms today because of people like Phyllis and Dell and Frank and Bayard and Jose and Amy and Marcia and Sylvia, who in times that were darker and scarier than this stood up and fought back and said no to oppression. And as a result, we live in a better world. We owe them a debt. And that is to stand up and continue the fight until the world is better than it is now. That is the lesson of LGBTQ history. I thank you for listening this morning, and I encourage you to take that lesson and to put it into practice in your own lives.
Spirit of life, our world is rich with diversity. Today, as we acknowledge National Coming Out Day, we give thanks for the gifts of sexual orientation and gender identity. We celebrate with our queer, transgender, bisexual, lesbian, and gay siblings who choose to come out and honor those who do not. Today, we say yes to the diversity among us, within ourselves, our families, our neighbors, and our communities. We claim that diversity as we come before you and as we go out into the world. At times, we turn away from this diversity, fearful of its transformative power. We reject that which is different, force it to be silent, or pretend it does not exist. We participate in systems of privilege, sameness, and uproot differences. Give us the courage to live boldly into the mysteries of diversity, the strength to persevere in the face of adversity, the power to love always in ways that go beyond understanding. Help us create a world where all the glorious, beautiful rainbow of humanity can flourish together. Amen.
No storm can shake my inmost heart, while to that rock I'm clinging, since love prevails in heaven and earth. How can I keep from singing?
Times continue to be difficult for lots of folks financially. We understand this. And at the same time, we need to ask you to be as generous as you possibly can in supporting our ministries, such as this one that provides our online experience each week, and our ability to help our members, friends, and our greater community where lots of people are in need of food, in need of utilities, in need of other things that will help them get by and survive this time of pandemic. We're deeply grateful for all you can contribute. Thank you. Our service has come to an end, and so we extinguish the flame of the chalice, but we remember to carry it with us in our heart at all times. We're grateful to have had Kevin Jennings with us this morning. We're grateful that you were with us this morning. Dear ones, continue to side with love. Encourage those who are feeling down and defeated. Help those who seek justice and healing. Be patient and compassionate with yourselves and others. Don't repay evil with evil, but seek to be kind and do what's right. Practice gratitude and rejoice always in the spirit of life and the power of love. See you next week.
Missing your friends? Interested in maybe making the acquaintance of some new ones? Why not join us for coffee in the Joint Congregation's virtual coffee hour? It's held in the Moose Zoom room. The address for that Zoom room is on your screen and will be on the chat windows in our Facebook pages. Please join us.